Thank you so much for inviting two lawyers here to the party and let us speak after industry legends. We're happy to hear that they're recommending to leave the country. We think it's good to move around in the world, and that's what our firm, Baker McKenzie, specializes in. I'm excited here with my partner, Manuel Lorenz, from our Frankfurt office. I'm in for 20 years now in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley, helping companies with their global expansion, with their startup process. And when we were planning this event here with our friends and partners in our Warsaw office, we were thinking with the 15 minutes that we have before lunch, we need to give you something interesting to talk about, some provocation that makes you want to do the opposite of what we say. And so we thought we'd start with a little checklist. I forgot my business cards completely. We don't use them anymore, so we brought these big ones. We have a little handout of the checklist, but you can also send us an email or our colleagues in Warsaw, and we'll give this to you electronically as well. Any company, whether it's fintech or insurtech, or we learned this morning at the first panel that you have Aztec now here in Poland as an innovation, will have to incorporate and think about, as a first matter, where you want to be. This is a question for all industries, and the fintech companies have to consider a few things that every company has to consider. And I think it's good to start with where the founders want to be. Now, this is a question not just for the founders, it's also for the investors. And you ask yourself where you want to live. It's usually not a good proposition to start in a place that you identified as legally or tax-wise a great place, but you will then not be there. I think you would have to be able to live there, and that's a good starting point. Besides that, though, there's a whole bunch of other things that can be considered and that everybody starting out should consider, such as, is there a good corporate environment that your investors like? Is there incubators, technical infrastructure? Are there good talent to hire? And a number of things that we put on this list here that we think that everybody, as they start out, should think about. If you already started in the wrong place, the earlier you move to the right place for your business, or that you cause the business that you're investing in, the better. Things can be corrected, but it over time becomes more and more expensive to correct them. With many tech companies, the intellectual property and the tax topics are particularly important, but with fintech companies specifically, they have to think about the regulatory environment. And we heard that one of the definitions of a fintech company that was promised on the first panel was they're banks that don't comply with the law. We don't necessarily comply with that, but we think it is very important to think about where you start out and have a regulatory analysis, at least a quick one on a budget done before you go too far, right? What do you think, Manuel?
Yeah, that's right. So potentially, you can settle any place in the world. So you have 200 jurisdictions. For example, in the US, you have to count maybe 50 alone if you look at the individual states of the United States. So the first point is identify a few key jurisdictions just to narrow down your choice to where you want to be. What are really your key markets, and that's the markets that you should focus on initially. The second thing is that most people don't spend enough time on when they plan, is really to set your business model out in a pure factual manner, because very often people go to their legal advisors, go to their regulators, and present some kind of diffuse idea about what their business model is all about, but they haven't really thought it through. They have sort of a general idea, which makes it extremely hard for a lawyer or for a regulator to tell you something about whether your model is regulated, what type of regulations you need to comply with. And the second thing that we think is very important, you need to start from the outset about possible alternatives to your business model. If plan A doesn't work, there should be a plan B or even a plan C. So what would be the acceptable alternatives that you would be planning for that still would get you where you want to be from a purely business point of view? So once you have that, and you still do not want to consult a lawyer, I mean, just go to the web pages of the regulators. So most of the regulators today are very much aware about fintech and have thought about the challenges that fintech is also posing for them. And some have made up their minds, some have put out very good materials that you can check, information leaflets, points of contacts, like as an example, the BaFin, the German regulator, has set up a working group. They have even a special questionnaire that intends to sort of guide you to ask the right questions and to put the right facts before the regulator. So just do that. And another easy way is one that we have developed quite recently. We have an app. You can find it on the App Store if you type Baker McKenzie and FSR, which stands for Financial Services Regulation. So it will give you all the regulated activities of the various countries that are covered by the app, including also the steps that you need to take in order to get the license where a license is required. So as a first cut, it gives you a very good comparison of the different markets, and in each of the markets it can tell you what is regulated activity and what is not regulated activity. Of course, you can also join a fintech association, so you can share the information, and sometimes it's also good to simply take a look at your competitors. So if there are competing models out there, maybe in another country that you want to copy, check what is their regulatory status. How have they done it to comply with regulation or to get around regulation? And finally, doing at least a high-level analysis of your business model in the key jurisdiction that you want to start with is always a good idea, and do that before you invest. So if you have sort of done all the steps before, then it's not such a big step to go see a lawyer and have the lawyer explain to you what are the possible regulations that could apply to you. Because if you start for too long a time to work on a model or even go into business and then find out that you're regulated, that's a bad idea. You could be cracked down and you could face sanctions. So do that early, and don't assume that once you've done your exercise for one market, it necessarily also applies in the next market, because in the next market, the rules may be different, and therefore you need to repeat the exercise.
Now, we heard that the regulation can be a burden, and we have some suggestions on what to do if you look at an ugly regulatory situation for your company. But we don't want to say that without acknowledging also that regulation can be your friend. It can be a positive thing. It can keep other market entrants outside, and picking a jurisdiction with a strict regulatory regime to install confidence and trust in the market and your potential customer and business partners can be a good strategy. For many startups, although, they want to avoid being too regulated, and there are some suggestions that we frequently give them to consider, including some of the following.
Yeah, the first is 2 words, tweak it, which means if we go back to your initial planning, so if you have already thought about what would be possible alternatives to run your business model if the first option doesn't work, then maybe the second option will get there. So it's always good to stay flexible, and then your advisors might be able to point out to you how you can tweak it in order to lessen the burden of regulation or even avoid regulation at all. The other one, which is a very common way of getting around being regulated and getting a license and having to spend all the money on compliance, is to partner with a financial institution, something that we call the fronting bank model or the reverse outsourcing model. And if you want to have more details, we're happy to answer questions on how these types of models work. But partnering with a financial institution can very easily get you around it. Of course, there are a few downsides. Usually your partner will have some share of your revenue in exchange for partnering up with you, but it may be a good idea. The third thing, the word sandbox was already mentioned. There are, of course, jurisdictions that are a little bit more favorable towards fintechs, and they offer you the possibility to go in a sandbox, try out your business model in a small scale, find out whether it works before they impose the full scale of financial services regulation on you. So you can try out that. That might not necessarily allow you to immediately start a big business, but you can at least try it out almost for free. And of course, particularly in Europe, we all live more or less on the basis of the same European directives, but the way it is applied by the different regulators may be different, and we've already heard Luxembourg, for example, Cyprus, Malta. There are some jurisdictions that apply regulation as an export article, and they apply the regulation in a more pragmatic way than other regulators. So that might be definitely a way of looking into this, although you always need to take into account if you meet the standard of a very strict regulator, like for example the German regulator. That means usually when you passport your model into another jurisdictions, it will be very rare that you would encounter additional obstacles. Whereas if you start out with a light touch legislation, then maybe if you move to a different jurisdiction, there might be additional requirements that kick in. And finally, the same solution doesn't always work in every market, so you have to stay flexible. So if your business model is a little bit more flexible, offers maybe 2 or 3 different ways to get to the same result, you will be much more successful in handling regulation in the different countries.
Besides the regulatory point, there's many other legal considerations that a fintech company should think about. On the regulatory side, we're talking about how to sum it up. Sometimes we recommend to the client, be more tech than fin, and that can be often a solution to get in. That was Manuel's quip yesterday. But there's a number of other areas that are particularly relevant. One is near and dear to my heart is data privacy and security compliance. It's a big topic, and what I would recommend to most companies, take it head on. I don't think the times where companies can put their head in the sand and talk about big data and think it's a positive thing after big banks too big to fail, big government and so on, I think they're over. I'm surprised that I meet quite a bit of this here in Europe, because the data protection laws are so strict, and Europe is actually trying to create a competitive advantage by having stricter rules in this area. But in every jurisdiction in the world, we have a number of US institutions here for good reasons, data privacy and security have been recognized as key topics, and if your whole architecture takes that into account early on, then I think you have much better success in convincing investors, later regulators, customers, that you have your business plan thought out and have it in order. Intellectual property protection, advertising, corporate laws, employment have to be considered in all areas, but you won't have to go to a different lawyer in every country to look at them. In many areas you can find kind of the strictest standard and put something together that works for most. Keep in mind though, wherever your business has an impact, where you're disrupting or you're being disrupted, will probably trigger some legally relevant points, and that is something that will have to be considered in this early planning. And I think if you work with advisors and incubators and so on that have experience of taking companies global and taking them across borders, you can save yourself a lot of headache by thinking about some of those things early on and not just focus on one market. Towards the end, we heard the regulators are in the room, they're thinking about it, they're watching us on television, and we have a few considerations for them too.
Yeah, I think from the outset, and maybe also because I'm a regulatory lawyer, regulation is important, and without regulation there is no trust of the public, of the markets into financial services companies, including fintechs. So there must be regulation. It serves as an important factor in keeping a local market attractive, and to have the sufficient amount of trust for people to come and actually buy the services. But still, you have to recognize, if you are a regulator, and most regulators have that on their agenda, that you are facing some kind of international competition. Those regulators that are more attractive, more amenable to fintechs will of course attract more fintechs, and therefore a regulator that would apply the law absolutely by the book in a very strict way will drive fintechs away. So don't demand too much. Normally in every kind of regulation the principle of proportionality is embedded, so you should make use of this and apply regulation proportionately to fintechs, otherwise that will drive fintechs away, and the end result will be by being too strict you essentially support the foreign competition. Now, a competitor might still need to apply local law or need to observe local law when he comes into the jurisdiction, but still there are lots of business models that work very well outside of the country, and then a strict regulator will just help the competition. And therefore our basic conclusion is good laws are important, and there are good examples of laws that have been specifically designed to address fintech needs. I mean, there is MiFID dealing with high-frequency trading, algorithmic trading. Germany, we have kind of some nice exemptions dealing with crowdfunding and crowd investing. But at the end of the day, what is decisive to make a market attractive is really a pragmatic application of regulation.
What we're trying in the US is to offer a special charter for at least some fintech companies so that they can come into the regulatory fold. I don't think the general request from Silicon Valley is usually to leave regulation all out, but I think in this area there will be a need for some order, and even if it's just to preempt different divergent state law regulation that so have to deal with. We hope this was helpful for you. We are happy to provide additional information. We have our email addresses up here. There's a number of our colleagues from the Warsaw office in the audience that would be happy to answer questions, and we've got these oversized business cards with the checklist as well. So if any of you are interested, we'd be happy to discuss this further with you over lunch or in the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Thanks.